Before you can begin to do a fluffy flower, you'll have to put on your machine your free motion foot. And there are a wide variety of different free motion feet. You might have one that resembles this with a metal cutaway bit at the front. Maybe yours is acrylic. These cutaway sections are very useful because you can see where you're going, but sometimes the little legs catch on any loose threads. You might have one that resembles this particular foot. Now, be aware that all of these feet have an arm sticking out, with the exception of Bernina's, and this arm needs to go over the needle bar. Bernina's feet could look something like this one, which is one for a more advanced machine or more updated machine than the one I'm using. And the foot that I like to use on my own machine actually has a cutaway front, although I could use the one that has the solid front. So whether you put on one of the feet that looks like this, perspex with not a cutaway front, or whether you use an open toe, the choice is yours. Having got the foot on the machine, you will then need to lower your feed dogs. Now the feed dogs are lowered either with a sliding button at the front here, maybe at the back, or in my case, it's on the side of the machine. My feed dogs are already lowered, so just let me raise them again because there's something interesting you need to be aware of. The teeth will only come back up again when you do one full revolution of the wheel. So lower your feed dogs. We've got the darning foot on, the free motion foot. You've lowered your feed dogs, and another good top tip is reduce your stitch length to 0. In addition to that, you're going to need an embroidery hoop, and I personally prefer the wooden ones, although you can use the plastic. Make sure the embroidery hoop goes underneath your presser foot. You might have to put your finger underneath it and lift it up. Ideally 8 inches is about the correct size. If you have too big an embroidery hoop, it keeps clonking at the edge of the machine. So we want a wooden embroidery hoop. We want our free motion foot on, your feed dogs lowered, your stitch length at 0, and all you're going to do now is thread up the machine and let's get sewing. I've threaded up my machine with 2 different threads. Now, if ever you're going to use a large cone like this one and it doesn't fit on the machine, quite a good option is to wind it onto a bobbin. Then you can put the bobbin on the machine rather than the large cone. On the underneath bottom bobbin, I've got a rayon thread. Now, if you're going to use something like a gold or metallic thread, as I said before, I would always put it on the bottom bobbin. So I've threaded up the machine. With regard to choice of needles, I tend to have a fairly large needle in there, something like a 14 or a 16. A 12 is just about okay, but remember that needle sizes, the higher the number, the fatter the needle. So I've got a reasonable sized needle in there. A universal one will do perfectly well. If you can't see to thread the needle, then use top stitch ones because they have a bigger eye. In my embroidery hoop, I've inserted a piece of calico and I've got it drum tight. If you're using a plastic one, you may need to really make sure you tighten up the screw because that calico or whatever fabric you choose, and it could be a piece of old sheeting, has got to be drum tight in there. So make sure you tighten up the screw. Calico in there nice and drum tight, thread it up the machine. The next thing to do is to cut a hole. And you want a round hole cutting, round about 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 inches in diameter. And to save fabric, cut it fairly near the edge of the hoop. You'll see why, because you can use this piece of fabric lots and lots and lots of times. Cut round. If you can't cut a rough circle just by eye, then draw round some small object. When you've done it, make sure you tighten up the fabric. I'm just going to get rid of those threads there because they might interfere with my daisy, my fluffy flower. Underneath the presser foot. If you can't get it underneath the presser foot, remember we can always raise it. Good starting move is to bring the bottom bobbin thread to the top. So drop your needle down, bring the bottom bobbin thread up, and just do a few stitches on the spot. Now remember, you are in control. You are the one who are going to push the embroidery hoop. And we're going to sew right across the hole. The Americans call it sewing on air. I'm going to go north and south, round the outside edge, staying on the calico, and I'm going to do west to east. Round again, and I'm going to put in the next point of the compass, straight across. Northwest to southeast or the other way round, and ditto over there. When you've done the 4 major points of the compass, we're going to thicken up the line, so go back again 2 or 3 times. round 2 or 3 times. Now I'm trying to run the machine and move the hoop at a fairly average speed. What we want to have happen is the machine to not be run so fast that the stitches get wrapped really tightly around each other. So run the machine at an average speed and move the hoop relatively quickly. Try and make sure you get long stitches. If you run the machine very fast and move the hoop very slowly, you'll get very tight little stitches. Right, once you've done the lines several more times, you're going to go into the middle and make like the hub of the wheel. Go roundy, 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 roundy. Just turn the hoop. Now, this is a fairly well-known embroidery technique, and many other people will just sew across the hole, but that makes the centre extremely thick. So I've made like the hub of the wheel, and I'm going to go in and out from the hub to the edge. In, out, in, out, in, out, in, out. If you up the speed, you must increase the rate at which you push the hoop. So into the fabric, into the hub, into the fabric, into the hub. Doesn't matter how far you go into the fabric. You obviously go too far, then you're just wasting thread. Into the fabric, into the hub. If you miss a bit or if it's a bit thin, you can come back and do it again. So in, out, like shake it all about. Keep on going. A bit like pushing a pram, backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And you don't want to have the hole much bigger than 1.5 inches. Maybe this is about maximum size. Otherwise it just gets too much to sew on air. Right, I've nearly finished. I'm now going to go back into the centre, and now I'm going to run the machine very fast and move it really slowly. Because what I want to do is to create a centre and anchor any loose threads down. And this is why you need a fairly robust needle, because you're actually going through quite a lot of thick threads there. When you think you've had enough, just skate to the edge. And there we have our fluffy flower. Ah, but you might say that doesn't look in the least bit like a fluffy flower, but here is the magic bit. I'm going to take the flower and I'm cutting it out. I'm not cutting through the fabric, I'm just cutting around the edge of the flower. If you get strange noises off, that's because my workshop is right beside the main road. And we have to put up with the builders coming and going, and they're putting a house up opposite, so it's never quiet at the moment. And all the way around. And when you've cut it out, you should end up with a fluffy flower, followed by people going up and down on skateboards. It's always quite exciting living in my house. So there is one fluffy flower. Now the great thing about this particular piece of work is actually I've got a reusable hole. So I can, if I want, make another flower in exactly the same space. Don't try to have too many holes. Always have one hole open. And if you're going to make more flowers, it would pay you just to have the one hole open at any one time. As you can see, I've made several flowers here. You can use these holes for probably up to about 4 or 5 times until it gets too thick round the outside edges. So literally make a hole, fill in the flower, leave the flower in situ before you cut it out again. Now, what I did with those flowers was to make a napkin ring. So let me now explain in a moment how I made the napkin ring. To make the napkin ring, all I did was to take some form of stiffening. You could use wadding. And the strip of fabric that I used was 1 3/4 inches by around about 6 to 6.5 inches long. You need a piece of fabric somewhat larger. And I literally wrapped this up inside. Tucked the ends in first, so one end in this end, one end in the other end, and just wrapped it up. I got rid of the raw edge here by folding it over and folding it up. So the raw edge was in the center of the band. All I did then was to use some form of decorative stitch down the middle and up and down the sides. Before I turned it into a napkin ring, I added the fluffy flowers. So literally they were just laid down on top here and then stitched in place. So there's a couple of fluffy flowers, because you could use flowers of all sorts of different colours if you so desired. And they can be stitched in place with literally a few stitches in the very center to hold them down. I would do this using the same free motion foot. So underneath the machine again, remember it pays to hold the top thread, drop the needle down, lower the presser foot, drop the needle down and bring the bottom bobbin thread to the very top. All you were going to do then is a couple of stitches on the spot, and this time I probably wouldn't be so idle as I was before. I would actually cut the threads off top and bottom and then just sew round, anchoring that fluffy flower in place. And you can see why having an open toe is not always such a good idea, because it catches. So you could anchor that one, you can anchor this one, then you can anchor the other one. Once you've done the anchoring, then to simply join the ends together, I just did it with either a ladder stitch or a neat hand stitch. You can't do that on the machine. And if you're wondering about the napkin, this is the easiest napkin to make. Take a piece of fabric, rip it out, and then stitch round just inside the edge using some form of decorative stitch. Then you can spend a happy time pulling all the threads out to make it more and more fringy. Or don't bother with that. Every time you wash it, a few threads will come out and eventually it'll get wonderfully fringed. So your fluffy flowers are done in your embroidery hoop, backwards and forwards. Use all sorts of different threads, and then they can be anchored wherever you happen to fancy. So the little picture I have here has a bit of free motion embroidery with some fluffy flowers added and some grass, which can be made in a similar fashion. Now I thought I can't leave you without knowing how to make grass, so I will show you briefly how to make some grass. But if you actually want a rerun of how to make a fluffy flower, you will find it in the Stitch Bits book, and it's there in glorious Technicolor on how you make a fluffy flower. So there it all is. Some people like to have it written down. But very quickly, how you make grass. To make grass, you need a slit. Don't go too mad on the slit, because you're going to have to sew across the slit. So this is a particularly small piece of grass. This actually could end up as eyelashes. So we have a slit. Exactly the same thing underneath the presser foot, bottom thread to the top, bring it up there, a few stitches on the spot, cut the ends off, and now all you're going to do is sew across the hole. Oh, come on, let's cut that off. There we go. Then go backwards and forwards across the hole. I'm going to go quite quickly, because it's rather boring watching somebody sew backwards and forwards across the hole. And remember that you can do this with all sorts of different threads. Just make sure you go backwards and forwards across the hole. Fill the hole in. The more you fill the hole in, just like the flowers, the more grass you'll get. So this is a very small patch of grass, but like my garden, tiny. When you get totally bored and have had enough, how it gets turned into grass is like this. You have to cut out the fabric on both sides. Do not just cut the threads out, or else you end up with a whole load of wiggly worms. Yeah, cut that out. And then you actually get 2 bits of grass for the price of 1. Because having cut the grass out, you can stitch so up the middle there, and there is some grass. And there's no reason why you can't take the grass, stitch the grass down. Let's just do it here. Set your machine to do a bit of zigzag. Variegated thread, this you won't see very much. Get the grass, lay the grass down, zigzag it down with maybe a side-to-sidey thread. This is where my machine presser foot will get caught. Anchor it down. There we go, there's some grass. Find one of my fluffy flowers where they all gone to. Let's see if we can find a fluffy flower a bit quick. Oh, there's a purple one. Stick the fluffy flower on. There we go. One fluffy flower. I'm just going to be lazy and jump to that. So we don't want it in zigzag mode anymore. Just sew round, fluffy flower. Tell you what, we could have a little leaf. There you are. And you can see how very quickly you could make some grass, add a fluffy flower, and you've got a 3D picture. And that's just a seriously silly bit of nonsense from Jennie Rayment.